Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is the Hill criteria, 9 criteria to establish causation without experiment. What I want to talk about today is a distinction we've been drawing in all of those previous discussions we had about inferior data. I suggested to you that experiment is the gold standard of how we actually gain causal knowledge. What I left open and what we discussed to some extent is what about the silver standard, the bronze standard, the copper standard? Do we actually gain causal knowledge through ways other than experiment? If we don't have such available information, can we make any causal inferences? And if so, what do we need to know in order to make them? A number of different people over the years have set out trying to establish different criteria by which we might gain causal knowledge, even if we don't necessarily have experiment or even where we do have experiment. One of these sets of criteria are what are called the Hill criteria, after Bradford Hill, the same physician we saw in the last class who was one of the contributors to determining that lung cancer is caused by smoking. And Hill established 9 criteria in the 1950s by which he wanted to set out a protocol or a set of guidelines by which one might judge whether information before someone was able to provide causal inference or not. And here are these 9 specific criteria. Strength, meaning power and or statistical significance, specificity, reproducibility, coherence, plausibility, gradient, temporality, experiment, and analogy. Now, we'll go through these now with an example using cigarette smoking and lung cancer and see how cigarette smoking, as an example, met 8 of these 9 criteria. The one lacking, experiment, which we discussed in the last class as well. For any set of observational studies, by definition, there's not going to be experiment. One of the 9 things is missing. The question then becomes, well, where do we draw the line? If only 4 of the 9 criteria are met, do we have causation? And if so, which 4 would be the ones that would be sufficient to create causal inference? If we lack certain criteria, can we exclude the possibility of causation? If so, which of these criteria are non-negotiable? These are the sorts of questions we'll have to be dealing with today, and hopefully we'll shed a little light, even if we don't reach a full answer. What I want to say first is that the Hill criteria are not like they're God-given and that these are the absolute truth. Other observational fields, such as the social sciences, oftentimes create their own sort of Hill criteria-like conditions to quote-unquote establish causation. Here, for example, is John Gehring's criteria from 2003, where he proposed a unified framework for the social sciences. He set out, it looks like about 9 or 10 different elements as well, not all exactly the same, but some overlapping with the Hill criteria, for which he would judge causation to have been established in the social sciences like economics or political science. So when I give you the Hill criteria, I'm just giving you one set of criteria as an example for causation, one that is typically used in epidemiology. Let's apply the Hill criteria now to the question of, does smoking cause cancer? Well, the first Hill criteria is strength, power, and statistical significance. Do the studies that reveal smoking causes lung cancer actually fulfill this Hill criterion? And the answer is yes. That a smoker's risk of dying of lung cancer is nearly 10 times, or actually more than 10 times that of a non-smoker's. There's true statistical power in those studies that show that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. So this Hill criteria is indeed met in the observational studies of cigarette smoking. What about specificity? Is it the case that when we have the cause, smoking cigarettes, that it usually results in lung cancer? Or vice versa, when we see lung cancer, that the usual cause is that the person also happened to be a smoker? Is that association a strong one? Is there specificity? And the answer is yes, that typically the link between smoking and lung cancer is specific for the effect. That is, that smoking consistently results in lung cancer as opposed to prostate cancer on some times and other times gland enlargement and other times lung cancer. It's a specific effect that comes about from cigarette smoking, namely lung cancer. It's not always the case that the effect has the same cause every time. There are other causes of lung cancer besides smoking, but they are far, far fewer and far more in between and rarer than it is the case that lung cancer is caused by smoking. So yes, that criterion is also fulfilled. What about reproducibility? Have these results in the observational studies been reproduced consistently over time? The answer is yes. The association between smoking and lung cancer has been observed in different types of studies of varying study populations at different ages, in different races, in different genders, at many different times throughout the last 60, 70 years that these studies have been ongoing, and there's been the same association viewed in almost all of those studies. So reproducibility, the fact that the event persists across multiple populations and study types, is also met in this case. What about plausibility? The idea of mechanism. Do we have some explanation for why cigarette smoking might cause cancer beyond the pure association that we see in these studies? And the answer there is also yes. We know cigarette smoke contains carcinogens that in lab studies, animal studies, and human studies have been shown to interact with certain oncogenes, certain genetic components of people that are found in lung cancers. So we know a plausible mechanism for how this is occurring. It's not just a pure statistical association. There's a story we can tell about why this occurs too. What about gradient? If you smoke more, does that increase your likelihood of getting cancer? The answer is yes. Lung cancer incidence rises with the amount of smoking, and it's also shown to decrease when someone quits smoking. What about temporality? Is it the case that people smoke and then they get lung cancer, or do they get lung cancer in these studies before they start smoking? And the answer is yes. In all of these studies, the stimulus, smoking, precedes the effect, cancer. So temporality, that the stimulus comes before the effect in the study, is shown for Hill criteria for cigarette smoking and lung cancer. What about experiment? Has there ever been an effective experiment that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer? And no, this is something where there's never been a well-designed, randomized, controlled experiment, and there probably never will be, given that it would probably provoke, at this point, ethical concerns. Of course, that's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We can't do the experiment because we know it causes it. And how do we know it causes it? Well, we would typically know that through experiment, but we can't do it. Now, notice something about what the Hill criteria are and are not. What Sir Bradford Hill said was that I don't believe, and this has been suggested, that we can usefully lay down some hard and fast rules of evidence that must be obeyed before we can accept cause and effect. Gazelian, the idea that we have to have an experiment and or else we don't know cause and effect, your rule is poppycock, he says. None of my 9 viewpoints can bring indisputable evidence for or against the cause and effect hypothesis, and none can be required as an indispensable condition. What they can do with greater or less strength, he says, is to help us make up our minds on the fundamental question. Is there any other way of explaining the set of facts before us? Or is there any other answer equally or more likely than cause and effect? In one sense, Bradford Hill agrees with what we've been saying throughout this class. In another sense, he disagrees. In all senses, we want to try to gain a sense of causation. And remember, I said earlier in this class that causation is vexing fact and controlling fiction. It's a bit of an artifice in and of itself. There's always an illusory nature to reality that we cannot quite grasp it, even with the best sense of causation. So in one sense, the Hill criteria are correct. We don't actually ever have one specific element that completely concludes causation for us. And yet, the question also poses a challenge to Bradford Hill and to others who say a checklist of different criteria where we just sort of make sure we're sort of following a cookbook is in itself also not sufficient. Because which criteria are necessary or which are not? And if you're saying you don't have to fulfill all criteria, which should we live out? On which terms and which conditions, or is it all ad hoc? That is, I sort of fit the evidence to my belief, not my belief to the evidence. And if that's the case, then it ends up being that there is no scientific fact, it's all opinion, and we're back to that Machiavellian concern we had way back when we were talking about illusions, that there is no truth, simply power plays, and that all reality is simply in the eyes of the so-called expert. Karl Popper, a very famous philosopher of science, got into a debate with Sir Hill about this issue, the two sirs, the knights, dueling it out on this. Popper felt that experiment was necessary and that to falsify an experiment was the only true aspect by which one could gain causal knowledge. Hill more was creating a checklist of verifying observation, saying that by verifying observation according to this checklist of criteria, we could in fact gain causal knowledge. Popper said that it's easy to obtain confirmations or verification for nearly every theory if we simply look for confirmations. Every good scientific theory, however, he said, is a prohibition. It forbids certain things to happen. The more a theory forbids, the better it is at gaining knowledge. In other words, by controlling the illusions more and more, Popper says, through falsification and ruling out illusions, we in fact are gaining knowledge. Confirming evidence should not count, he said, except when it is the result of a genuine test and experiment of the theory. So Popper was very much opposed to these Hill criteria, saying that it was creating the illusion of causal knowledge for observational studies, when in fact only truly when that ninth condition, experiment, was fulfilled, could you gain that causal knowledge. Hill rebutted this in a way by saying, finally, in passing from association to causation, I believe in real life, unlike Popper's dream world of ideals, that we shall have to consider what flows from a causal decision. On scientific grounds, he says, we should do no such thing. The evidence is there to be judged on the merits, and in that judgment, in that sense, should be utterly independent of what hangs on it, or who hangs because of it. But in another and more practical sense, he said, we may surely ask what is involved in our decision. In other words, Bradford Hill was saying, look, I agree with Popper on one level. In an ideal world, all the Hill criteria would be met, including experiment, before we make a conditional statement that causation is shown. And for that reason, he said, I think scientists really should be very cautious about making conclusions of causation until all the evidence is in and available. On the other hand, he said, sometimes we have to act prudently to avoid risk, even if we're acting in the realm of uncertainties, not risks, but uncertainties. And so in that realm, he says, we might tend to call something a risk, even if a scientist wouldn't call it a risk, simply to mobilize precautionary concern. What I would suggest, though, is that is it in fact justified for Hill to say such a thing? Should we scare the public about things by calling them risks when we know full well as scientists that we don't know the answer, simply to get people to act what we believe to be appropriately? Is that paternalism? Is it correct? Or is that justified behavior to mislead by calling something that is truly an uncertainty a risk to prevail in the court of public opinion? And this is ultimately what this debate is about, is a debate about epistemology, or the acquisition of knowledge. So let's ask the question, how many or which of the Hill criteria should be fulfilled in order to say we have causal knowledge? Well, remember that for the smoking and lung cancer case that we just went through, 8 of the 9 Hill criteria, except for the important one of experiment, were fulfilled. But it's also the case, if you think back to this scenario we had about does coffee prevent Parkinson's disease, that those studies, and there are many of them testing that hypothesis, but they're all observational, fill 8 of the 9 Hill criteria likewise, except experiment. So notice that in both these cases, 8 of the 9 Hill criteria are fulfilled. And yet, 89 to 92% of adult Americans believe smoking causes lung cancer. It's a foregone conclusion, whereas only 40% of Chinese adults believe the same thing, that smoking causes lung cancer. So who's right? Are the Americans right to overlook the 9th Hill criteria for smoking? Or are the Chinese right, perhaps by not accepting this or simply being uninformed, that only a minority of Chinese believe that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer? Moreover, remember that we had a statement put forward to us by those discoverers of the association between coffee and Parkinson's disease. They too fulfilled 8 of the 9 Hill criteria in their studies, lacking experiment. And what they cautioned us was, most important, the observational nature of the study design that we have created prevents concluding that coffee or caffeine directly protect against the development of Parkinson's disease. Further studies should be undertaken. So why is it in the case of cigarettes and lung cancer, we accept it as a foregone conclusion, even though only 8 of 9 Hill criteria are fulfilled from observational studies, that in fact this is causal, whereas something that looks, at least on paper when we're doing the cookbook checklist, coffee and Parkinson's disease, that 8 of 9 are fulfilled, and yet the authors themselves are warning us, don't take a causal conclusion from our study. What I want to suggest is that although smoking and lung cancer have not fulfilled completely the 9th Hill criterion of experiment, they have partially fulfilled it. Whereas for coffee and Parkinson's disease, there is no fulfillment of that 9th criterion, that important one of experiment. And so when we ask the question, why is smoking known to cause cancer, but coffee is not known to cause Parkinson's? The answer is what we call semi-experiment. A semi-experiment is a non-randomized, and that's important because we know randomization controls for confounders, bias, and chance that otherwise couldn't be controlled for in an observational study. But in a non-randomized yet dramatic, clear, and usually very rapid real-world event that gives us strong insight into the causal nature of an event, we have a pseudo-experiment set up. It's sort of a tie break where we actually think that even though experiment is not randomized, there is some sort of experiment going on that suggests that the 9th criterion of Hill has been fulfilled. And in the case of smoking and lung cancer, there are such experiments, and they are multiple in number. For example, in Hill and Dahl's early studies, there was a 10-year lag in lung cancer incidence rise among the women physicians as opposed to the men. And that's because smoking became common for women 10 years after they became common for men to smoke. And so you would expect that if culturally women began smoking later, their lung cancer should start developing later. And indeed, it did. Lung cancer incidence also continued to rise for women, although it's been declining in men over recent years because men commonly began to quit smoking in the 1970s. Women began to quit smoking first in 1989. And so as a result, Hill and Dahl, in a later study in 2004, predicted that starting in 2004, women's rates of cancer should start going down because the lag time for when women started quitting and when you would start to expect to see lung cancers manifesting if women had not quit was about 15 years. And indeed, the female incidence of lung cancer started dropping exactly in 2004, just as Dahl and Hill had predicted. Finally, there's been significant reduction in mortalities noted among quitters of cigarettes as opposed to those who don't. And here's a nice set of charts that show exactly that point in a semi-experimental fashion. Notice that we have different age groups here. In the top left graph, we have people who stopped smoking at age 25 to 34. The top upper right graph, people who stopped smoking at the ages of 35 to 44. The bottom left graph, people who stopped smoking at the ages of 45 to 54. And the bottom right graph, people who stopped smoking between the ages of 55 and 64. What you see here are three different curves. One curve, the red curve, are non-smokers in each graph. One curve, the blue curve, are cigarette smokers. One curve, the dotted line curve, are people who quit smoking in that specific age group for each particular graph. And what you see is the survival rate at any given age, starting between the lowest end of the range of that age and the highest end of the range. Of course, at the right end side of the curve, everyone dies eventually, and so the percentage who are surviving at any given age drops to zero, even among non-smokers eventually. But what you note is that for people who stopped smoking at the ages of 25 to 34, in the top left graph, the mortality rate of non-smokers was identical to those who quit smoking and was much higher at younger ages than the mortality curve for cigarette smokers. In other words, if you quit smoking before the age of 34, there was no increased risk of lung cancer from smoking as opposed to non-smokers. At least that's what the data here show. Whereas cigarette smokers who continued to smoke in that age range died. Top right curve, you notice that the dotted line starts to move down a little bit from the non-smoker curve. In other words, if you quit smoking between the ages of 35 and 44, you actually had a risk of increased early death over non-smokers, but only slight. And cigarette smokers, of course, who have smoked throughout their life, have a significantly increased mortality at a younger age risk. Bottom left curve, you see the dotted curve moving down towards the cigarette smokers curve and away from the non-smokers curve, which suggests that if you quit smoking at 45 to 54, the damage has been done, and you're starting to look more like perennial cigarette smokers who die at younger ages, even if you quit in your 40s or 50s. And finally, in the bottom right curve, people who quit smoking at ages 55 to 64, the quit curve is much closer on the mortality curve to the cigarette smokers than it is to the non-smokers, suggesting that if you quit at a late age in life, the damage is done, and it's almost as if you were to continue smoking at that point. This is a nice semi-experiment. It shows that the earlier you quit, the less damage has been done to your lungs, and the more likely you are to live a normal life, just as if you were a non-smoker. This is a form of what we would call quasi or pseudo experiment. Of course, there are potential confounders. For example, maybe there's a genetic condition that causes you to quit and also to avoid lung cancer. And so genetics couldn't be ruled out in such a case. Still, this is a nice example that provides a pseudo experiment or a semi-experiment, further confirming the observational studies that are out there. But we could do a thought experiment and ask ourselves the following. What would be the influence on our knowledge of causation and our conclusion that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer if today a study were published that were randomized, well-controlled, with large numbers of enrollees that tested whether smoking caused lung cancer? And contrary to all these observational studies that have been done so far, the study revealed that there was no increase in occurrence of or change in the natural history of lung cancer between cigarette smokers and non-smokers. What would we do? Would we conclude that ultimately everything's been wrong and that cigarette smoking doesn't cause lung cancer? Or would people still persist and try to fight back? I suspect the latter would occur, and yet there's exactly this sort of scenario that has come up recently with corticosteroids. Corticosteroids are used to treat head injuries, and 8 of the 9 Hill criteria had been met, showing that for people who had acute brain trauma and came into the ER, they were typically, up until recently in 2004, treated with an infusion of corticosteroids to reduce swelling in the brain, or at least so the theory went, and therefore to reduce the risk of bleeding out in the ER when they already had head trauma. Every hospital in the country treated this way, and everyone had taken it for granted that this was right because there were many observational studies, just as there have been for cigarette smoking and lung cancer, showing that use of corticosteroids reduced intracranial swelling and therefore prevented additional deaths in hospitals. No one, however, had ever put it to the fundamental experimental test. And for whatever reason, the scientists got authorization to do so, and when they tested it, something shocking occurred. They discovered that not only did corticosteroids have no effectiveness in preventing additional brain trauma, they actually worsened it. In the Lancet study that came out, the editors in a shocked editorial wrote, "Administration of corticosteroids to brain-injured patients has seemingly caused more than 10,000 additional deaths in the 1980s and earlier." They said the key message from this study is that applying treatments with unproven effectiveness is like flying blindly. In other words, experiment really is a very important aspect, and there's a reason that we do these large-scale randomized trials to gain scientific knowledge. It's not just an exercise in niceties. It's really an attempt to try to create causal knowledge. There's been other historical semi-experiments throughout history that have tested various phenomena. For example, the Dutch hunger winter, where an entire generation of Dutch mothers were starved over the course of a winter during Nazi occupation in Holland. And there were studies then later done on malnutrition and various different genetic diseases in their offspring, going on for many decades thereafter. And so that was an example of where a very sharp intervention where the Nazis had blockaded Holland allowed for certain scientific studies to be done as semi-experiments. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs that went off, a rapid infusion of radiation to a population and the effects of radiation on the public showed a cancer linkage that otherwise probably couldn't have been shown because you couldn't have irradiated people in this fashion. Prohibition in alcohol, effects of liver cancer and other diseases where alcohol usage was dropped significantly because of prohibition were studies that could be done. And the London smog in 1952, where a very acute smog gripped the city of London for several days and weeks, was a nice form of semi-experiment where various asthma-related illnesses and lung illnesses and pulmonary illnesses could be studied as a result of very acute, sharp, unanticipated introduction of smog into the population. So all of these are examples where scientists have taken creative use of naturally occurring experiments to try to fulfill that Hill criteria. The problem with the Hill criteria, as Karl Popper said, is that some genuinely testable theories, when found to be false, are still upheld by their admirers. For example, by introducing some ad hoc auxiliary assumption or by reinterpreting the theory ad hoc in such a way that it escapes refutation. We sort of work around the inconveniences of our theory. If we don't like the way the data are going, we bend the data to our theory and not our theory to the data, as good science should do. Such a procedure, he said, was always possible with criteria like the Hill criteria, but it rescues the theory from refutation only at the price of destroying, or at least lowering, its scientific status of giving us causal knowledge. In other words, if you aren't careful in your use of criteria like the Hill criteria, really being careful in your use of observational studies to create causal inferences of knowledge, then knowledge becomes a meaningless term if those criteria are used loosely. I and several other scientists have written on this topic ourselves, and when we have written on this, we've said things to the following extent in one of our papers, that in the evolution of knowledge about an association that eventually becomes established as known causation, gaps or contradiction in the data will make it impossible to satisfy the needed number of criteria, 9, to establish causation. If no single Hill criterion is necessary and no group of its criteria are required, there is no objective basis for analyzing the state of human understanding about a causation. If you can't tell me how many Hill criteria in advance are necessary, if you can make it up after the fact that, 6 got fulfilled and that's enough, then the goalposts are always moving whether we know something or not. And then we really don't know anything at all is our point. So it's always important to specify in advance what would be sufficient for causal knowledge, not after the fact. That doesn't always end up holding. Some, even scientific agencies, seem very comfortable manipulating the Hill criteria or other such criteria whenever it suits their purposes. For example, here's one that seemed to me a bit crazy from the European Environmental Agency, which said that even temporality, the idea that a cause comes before an effect in time, is something that you could suspend. Maybe the cause comes after the effect. I don't know about time warps. I've never seen such things happen, and to my knowledge, that's scientifically impossible, but not to the European Environmental Agency, supposedly. So again, coming back to how do we know causation, I'm going to return to something we said in all of those lectures about inferior data. When we have experimental knowledge, randomized controlled trials, for example, that really is the gold standard for knowledge. When it comes to silver standards or bronze standards or other things like that we gain through observational quote-unquote knowledge, maybe we can call it knowledge in some extreme circumstances where we have semi-experiment or something else to fulfill that important Hill criteria. But if not, isn't the burden on the producer of those observational studies to say why they think that that is knowledge, when in fact it's not fulfilling what most scientists throughout history have recognized to be essential, which is manipulation and experiment, and particularly in a randomized controlled setting, in order to yield causal knowledge. So I want to return in the final slide to something we talked about before, way back when we talked about probabilistic causation. This intuition that we all have that every possibility that we can come up with, every conjecture, every hypothesis carries some positive probability of being true. We knew that was not right because of Kolmogorov's axioms way back when we talked about that statistics simply doesn't accept such a fact. But there was a second element to probabilistic causation that has sort of an intuitive feel of being right because of our human aspects of understanding intuitively risk and our sense of trying to survive. And that is that if there's a particular possible association in our mind that we think could be true, but it's uncertain, that we say that by discovering more evidence in favor of it, that we have somehow come closer to the truth. And what I want to suggest is that Karl Popper and others have said that too is false philosophically, that we falsify things through experiment. We don't simply try to go and acquire more knowledge in favor of our hypothesis, because lots of observational studies can be done to study something and therefore create a seeming veneer of truth about it. But verification is not how science is necessarily done to gain causal knowledge. We exclude confounders, bias, and chance, and thereby rule out falsities and illusions and gain causal identity. Okay, we're done for today, and in the next class we're going to move on to something called meaningful causation, which is even if we know causation exists, does it matter? See you there.